This is Hannibal here from the Hannibal TV on YouTube and the Hannibal TV UFO channel on YouTube, which is our strictly UFO channel where we're airing this live right now with none other than engineering infinity author Gene Cisco, who's also a member of MUFON, Massachusetts, and a part-time opera singer. How are you doing today, sir?
Good, not me. Don't put that opera singer. That's all Nat. I'll throw a little Broadway. We do a little couple of Phantom of the Opera duets every now and then. If I get a cocktail in me, and
Now, is that a ghost that just shadowed behind you, or is that
no,
your wife?
that's my sister getting the dog's evening meals together. Is she was that was her shadow.
What's your theory? And we are going to get into UFO news this week, but I was just watching a video on consciousness, and I've studied that a lot. You're an extremely smart individual. What's your theory on consciousness, and what role does the actual physical brain play in a human's way of thinking?
It's funny. I would if you asked me that before I got involved with my father-in-law's works, and there's such a big part of that that's dedicated to consciousness, I'd have gone back to my good old Catholic school upbringing and, really thought of consciousness in terms of religion, and in terms of spirituality. But, everything that I've seen in my father-in-law's work, I would say actually reinforces to a large degree, the faith aspect of it, but really is about the connection that we have to the universe, and that we, need to constantly be working on developing that connection to the things that are outside of us. And with the work my father-in-law did, he really spelt it out that consciousness is a tuner. It's the channel that we're tuned into. I'm tuned into Gene 1015. You're like Hannibal 101, 4.9. And that's why we've met. Our frequencies are kind of aligned in that way. And when I dissected all of that and really thought about it, it began to answer all of those questions, like, why do you connect sometimes with people? Why are there other people that you just don't really, you just look at them and you're not going to like them? Why do you wind up in places and situations and all the rest of it? And, it's this frequency, this consciousness that, and our connections to it. And you look at people who meditate, and I think that's the same thing. They are working to expand the range of the frequencies that they are able to tap into with their consciousness.
Have you heard anything about some of these theories that extraterrestrials allegedly can transfer their consciousness if their physical body is about to pass?
I've heard that, I've heard along the lines just with the basic communications, the psionics, which is coming more mainstream here. I go back, there was an old movie, I think it was called Powder. And it was, the kid who had albinism and was bald and born, during a lightning storm. And there was a phrase in that where they said that, energy doesn't die. It just changes shape. It just changes formation. It has to go somewhere. And I saw that. I think I was relatively young, if a teen, maybe a young adult. And that really resonated with me. It really stuck with me. So, I think even our own consciousness has to go somewhere. So the idea that that would extend to other forms of life or intelligent life, I'm perfectly open to understanding it. That's for sure.
I just hope if our consciousness is transferred into another form of life, we don't end up as some of these baby ducks that are fed to crocodiles or something in our
Yeah.
next life. Because it's like, do they also have a consciousness, or are they just unlucky and get the horrible life of just being alive to be eaten in a horrible death?
Might be, well, that's basic circle of life. We learned that in Lion King, right? We just got
Yeah.
we just got to take our place. But I always say, if I get to come back as an animal, I want to be a river otter and just kind of float there and have the food on my chest and just eat all day, and that would be ideal.
So we had this big hearing this week that I like this the best of all of them, and I think it's because the Congress people they already got like the initial questions out of their system, and it seemed like every single one of them were taking it seriously. Maybe not as an ET craft, but as a craft that we don't know where they're from. It's either a very black U.S. operation. Some foreign entity has jumped us in technology, or it's ultra terrestrial, or it's extraterrestrial. What were your thoughts overall on the hearing? And of course, we'll get into the big bombshell of it after.
Sure. No, I think it was good. It definitely, going into it, I was amongst, I think, a lot of people who thought it was going to be a giant nothing burger. But there turned out to be some very impactful moments, some very relevant, convincing testimony. Again, I think we were sort of promised the firsthand people, with hands and eyes on craft kind of witnesses. But Jeff Nusatelli, he was fantastic in conveying his story, and even
I really liked him, by the way. I just got to throw it in there. He is one of the most credible whistleblowers I've seen because I understand that David Grush and all this, he's credible too, but for some reason, that Nusatelli guy just came off as a straight shooter.
Yeah, he is. We came out of the same career field in the military. He was a much later generation than I was. And I
And
had
let's
sent him
review
private.
what you were again, just for the new fans that haven't
Yeah,
seen you before.
yeah. So that was, I was U.S. Air Force Security Forces. In my period, it was a different career field. So I was a security specialist, which specifically focused on nuclear weapon systems, aircraft and personnel security. And then there was the law enforcement side, which was more your traditional military police. And around the time I was leaving in 99, those began to merge and everybody was doing everything. But, I had sent Jeff a note following it, congratulating him, on the appearance and how well he did. And I said to him, I said, if they did a whole hearing and could bring in a bunch of Air Force cops, people would probably be shocked at the amount of things that we could tell them collectively as a community, of what they've seen and experienced. And it's to take nothing away from somebody like David Grush, who was a major and an officer and involved in a lot of the more strategic planning type things. But you can never go wrong with the guy on the ground. You don't ever underestimate that person standing there checking the IDs and walking the post, because they're the ones out there in the cold or the heat for 12 plus hours sometimes.
So, did you witness anything that you're able to talk about during your time?
Nope, never had an experience. I was stationed with a guy, and I actually tried reconnecting with him. We still have some probably second, third hand connections. But I remember he was telling me he actually, claimed to have been abducted from the barracks dormitory, one night, and it was sort of a consciousness, metaphysical type. He didn't feel as though, he was physically taken, but he described it in a sort of astral projecting type situation. And I worked with a lot of people who worked out in Area 51 and Tonopah and, Indian Springs, Creech Air Force Base, and a lot of them would say, I can't talk about what I've seen, but there's some weird shit I can't explain. And they'd sort of lead it to that. And only one time did I have a colleague who was like, he's like, oh yeah, there's basically some kind of hotline that the government has direct to the aliens. And he talked about some crash that had happened. and that we had recovered an alien baby, and through this network that we have, we were able to return the baby, or they came back and got the baby. Um, that was during the 90s, and I never sort of heard those things again. I haven't heard them come up again yet, but it just goes to show there's a lot of people that still have stories that they might not have shared yet.
And that goes to the video that you commented on the other day, and I'll have to look up the name of the book, but it was on the Jesse Michaels channel. I had watched this guy that was he had come up with the theory, and you watch it too. You're aware of him, that the U.S. government is working with some type of breed of ultra terrestrials that are in mountains and under earth, and we're kind of like the first line of defense to some potential negative extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
Do you want to just tell the fans here what you said in the comment, and I'll look. If you don't remember the name of the book, I'll look
Yeah, I
it up.
don't remember. Yeah, look it up and quote me, because you know, I my overall question, and the way I try to approach this, and and we'll probably get into it a little bit deeper when we talk about the video from the hearing. Um, there when it comes to the government, there has to be a threat. What is the threat that we are creating defenses against? We hear these things about nationals, oh, the national security. Well, what is the national security implication? So that says to me, either we don't know if it is a threat or not, and they are acting out of an overabundance of caution, or we know there is a threat. And when I look at my father-in-law's works, that we published in Engineering Infinity, the book, when I look at those works and compare them against U.S. defense programs, there are programs that had developed that would directly counter the type of craft and technology that he details in his papers that we published. And then the third option is there's some combination. There may be the good ones, and there may be others that we're not quite sure. So that's the Sphere Network book.
Yeah, that was the name of the guy's book. But I mean that idea does seem kind of credible that at some point contact might have been made, because what do you make of the Holloman Air Force Base landing, for instance, which some people say was even caught on tape and originally at some point was going to be released to the public through that UFOs Past, Present, and Future movie, but it never ended up being approved. I think the video of it coming in for the landing
Yeah.
was approved, but the actual landing was not.
Yeah, exactly. It's so hard to say, because I really try to take in evidence. Everybody calls everything evidence, and in one sense, yes, it is. The difference being they want to say it's objective evidence and it's kind of subjective evidence. And even the video, at the hearing, while it's a great video, to me creates a lot more questions
Yeah.
than
My dad that was in the military too, he didn't
yeah.
even respond to me sending it. Like, what the hell? To me, I'm like going crazy and like, yeah,
Yeah, it's
sure.
fantastic. So all of these videos, these things flying by, all of that, great. And it comes to my, as a newcomer to the industry, it comes to my when it lands in my lap, I just sit there and I'm like, okay. And I kind of have the feeling, so what? I'm like, we're not prosecuting a case here, right? We are not who and it's like people are trying to collect evidence and prosecute a case to I don't know who, because if it's the government sitting there acting as the judge, and executioner of disclosure, they're certainly not interested, and nothing's going to come out that they say, oh, yeah, you got us, geez, okay, here's everything you want. There's the community that just seems to argue about the details of everybody's opinions of what they look at, without doing, I think, what's the more important work of saying, okay, here it is, very interesting. Now, where do we take it next, and what do we do with it, and what answers do we look for out of it? Instead, we just sit and dissect it ad nauseum, which goes into, my ideas or think, lines of thinking and questions of saying, well, I wonder, again, they just put this video out here. This will shut us up for the next, 6 months, if not more, as everybody dives into it. So, I tend to have some ideas, or not get as excited about some things, but look at what we get in order to say, all right, what's the next step, and what can we do with this, and what other questions can we ask? And I think all of the witnesses in the hearing gave us those kinds of materials, and I have yet to hear anybody sort of structure anything in that way that says, well, here's what we need to be looking for next. Here's, what we should be asking Congress, or here's what we do with this information now that we have it. Sometimes it seems like people are just interested in feeling like, oh yeah, now we've got them, it's undeniable, but they'll still deny it. So I don't know what the hell they want.
Well, one thing that's undeniable that I don't understand why it's not bigger news, because it really, I mean, it's not news in Canada. I can tell you that by the people I know there. They
Yeah,
don't care at all about it. And it didn't seem to really break other than small stories here. But the interesting thing is, it does hit this craft. It doesn't blow up or whatever it is. I will assume it's a craft, because
yeah,
when it's not magnified, it looks like it breaks into pieces and the pieces follow it. But when it is magnified, it seems like it's hit. It doesn't blow up. It just continues on. But the craft itself separates into possibly scout crafts or go into formation and follow it. So if it's not, we better hope it's alien. To like,
yeah.
I mean, there's no proof, I guess, that it is U.S. airspace. The way that it's magnified, but we can take the congressman at his word on that. Perhaps, I don't know.
Well, and that's why I say, we got to sort of break down. There's so much to unpack in that, and with that video. So number one, allegedly, so Burleson presented the video, but we learned afterward he doesn't really know where it came from. It was, quote unquote, dead dropped. So, if you're not familiar with that term, that's essentially, if you ever watched a spy movie and the spy takes documents and puts them in an envelope and tapes it, underneath the park bench somewhere in DC. And sometime later, the other spy comes by and removes it and walks off with it. That's a dead drop. So, I found that interesting in and of itself, that he would present it, yet not really know the origins or provenance of it. Perhaps he doesn't. He's just covering for something. Again, so you wound up on both things. Either he does know and he does, or he doesn't know and he's not, willing to say who, and just says, oh, it was dead dropped. So we know, it was Yemen. It was it had to do with or that was the area of operation, let's say, was around Yemen. We know it involved the Reaper drones. We know it involved two Reaper drones, one that fired the missile, and then the other one that was actually taking the video of the area of operation. So if you think about it, Hannibal, we've got, anytime there's military operations going on now, they have the drones right around the battlefield sending real-time data, and images back to the command structure. Previously, it used to be satellites, and now they put those up. So, the questions are like, okay, well, what else? What was happening initially? What was the initial mission? Was it just a surveillance mission of the area? Were they looking for the Houthi pirates and happened upon this craft? Because that begins to paint more of a picture from an operational perspective, and point you in directions of what else might have been out there. So if they were doing that, was there a battleship group nearby, or all of those little intricacies that could be followed up on to begin to look for more information. We see the missile, as you said, go through slash hit slash split, depending on what assessment you want to accept. The one thing that for sure is it didn't expire or explode. And what happened to the missile afterwards? You see it going off screen, and on another show I was on earlier in the week, we kind of caught that and started looking and say, well, it started giving off a little bit of that heat signature. Was it turning around, or did they detonate it? But that had to go somewhere. So where did that end up? And again, the only ones who can answer that's the War Department now.
Yeah, and I'm just looking up where Yemen is, and I do recall now that you mention it that it was U.S. footage, but from a mission in Yemen, I guess, and that's an area that links the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden.
Right.
So we keep hearing about these underwater UFOs and their connection to water. So
Yeah, and we've talked about it when I've been on before. My father-in-law's work, the importance of water to the craft that he describes in its thermonuclear system that essentially creates the power. So again, I still kind of look at the underwater aspect as being the gas station for these things. It could also be sort of a anti-radiation, after they've as they operate. That might be part of it as well. So I lean more towards a practical purpose, like the power system, like the radiation system, the idea of cooling the crafts and things like that. I lean more on that side than things like, oh, there's underwater bases and underwater civilizations and whatnot. And again, that's just mine.
yeah, and I believe Tim Burchett brought up that he's heard a lot of reports from the Navy. I don't know if it was in that, or I believe it may have actually been in an interview after to CNN, I believe it was, now that I think of it, where he said he's heard a lot about underwater bases. And I think he mentioned it briefly to George Knapp, now that I think about it. And then in this interview, someone asked him more, and he believes something like that. But I've also heard Lou Elizondo say that he's seen cases of UFOs actually sucking up water, where it could be, as you said, it's some type of fuel for them. Who knows?
Right. Even in my father-in-law's papers, he describes, and there's a video circulating that shows it as well. But in his papers specifically, he says there was a large UFO recently near the sun extracting plasma. And he goes on through the science to talk about how plasma could then be converted for the deuteronium for water as part of the system. And there's that video out there. So yeah, like Lou describes, it's sucking up water. That's why it's sucking up water, according to the documents we have, because it's just part of that thermonuclear system.
And I've also heard other scientists speculate that underwater they could be coming from planets that are underwater. So being underwater is most like where they're from. So that's just the most comfortable place for them to be.
Yeah, listen, I'm open to all of it. Again, I just try to I just go with the information I have available to me, which I'm at this point, after 5 years of living with it and diving into it, and most importantly trying to disprove it. I'm like, all right, this is a solid piece of work, and this is what I'm basing my things off of. All of it could be, it could be true.
Yeah, and it
Yeah,
could be
so
different breeds going
and I
down
can
there
feel
for
that.
different places for different reasons.
Yeah, and anything I have, on it or to say about it is really just an opinion as everybody else's is. Because at the end of the day, we can believe, we don't know. This is still a lot we just don't know. Um, but whatever helps folks sleep, you know.
American Road Warriors all fired up that people were saying that it bounced. Maybe they didn't see it magnify, but I do know that Knapp and his buddy exaggerate sometimes, but
Yeah, it was
Knapp is
certainly
more credible.
yeah, I mean, I mean, I wouldn't categorize it as bouncing. I would, when I first saw it, the way I described it, I was like, wow, if that was a, a Mack truck hitting a Hyundai, the Hyundai just deflected that Mack truck. Um, so it's certainly, that in a, go back to some of the old traffic investigation uh talents, what you would have expected the craft to do and the missile itself to do, both seem to defy, normal physics in a lot of ways.
What did you think of Knapp's testimony overall? He must be feeling very vindicated after years of being looked down upon and joked at, that now he's actually testifying to Congress. Wow.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, let's face it, he's the godfather of the whole thing in many ways, and bringing it out. The so obviously the Russia aspects of what he talked about, I was particularly interested in, and paid a lot of attention to, and not that I didn't pay attention to the rest of it. But what I liked most about his testimony was the idea that, being under oath, he now had the opportunity to really speak for the larger community. And I feel like he said a lot of things that everybody has been saying, and now it's on the record, for what it matters. It's on the record, it's in there. He called out things that needed to be called out. And yeah, the doctor just would, Napa's OG, that's right. And at probably what, almost 80 years old now, what the hell does he got to lose um to do it? And I often wonder if that's why they cut him off a little bit sometimes, it seemed. Because yeah, he's got nothing to lose at this point. He's had his career.
Yeah, and I guess the only negative thing against them was they need to do their own vetting of those Russia documents to double check that they're legit. But the interesting thing that he seemed to indicate is like only 98% of the information of them is still not out in the public. So he's only talked about a small percentage of the
Yeah,
information.
yeah, and I've made no secret of it. I've when my Russian documents dropped on my lap 4 years ago, he was one of the first ones I reached out to, trying to connect with, figuring, well, if anybody knows about it, it's going to be him. But based on the statement and the testimony, I kind of have the feeling, he might have been avoiding, or hesitant to have a call, because it seems like he handed so much of it off to, what was it, Bigelow and ATIP, and who knows what they told him, or what they were doing with it. But my overall assessment is, compared to the materials I have too, was he seemed to have all of that high level confirmation that talks about the specific programs. And as he described it, that the Soviets had the largest program in the world when it came to investigating phenomenon, and researching and attempting to reverse engineer. And so I've kind of looked at that, and I was like, all right, that's great. That's a little vindicating, validating. And that what we have as part of that is the work product. So, on the one hand, great. On the other hand, it even frustrated me, because I'm sitting here and I'm like, well, geez, you could have walked in there, and again, I don't care if you mention my name, mention anything. You could have walked in there and said, here's the high level program, and here's something that seems to be the actual work product of it, and have detailed schematics and
It's
measurements of UFO.
politics that even he's going to play into. He doesn't want to have to get you credit at this point. And
Yeah, but that would have been a watershed moment. Um,
could
particularly
still
him saying,
happen. It could still happen. Just
"Let's
keep
go
doing
ahead."
what you're doing.
I'm always willing to. like I said, I'm another guy. I got nothing to lose. I'll go out there. I will tell the story and well, I've made everything public already. So my only purpose at this point is trying to explain it to other people for everyone to get their heads around. But it's absolutely consistent, with his testimony. And but like I said, overall, I think I was happy to hear a lot of the things that he said, and he mentioned Bob Salas, and he mentioned the nukes. And I think Congress had been so hesitant. I said it's almost as if Congress can't have a Bob Salas come out there, because if he's talking about nuclear weapon system security in the 1960s and something anomalous that was able to shut it down, well, the natural questions that lead to it are, oh my God, well, is that a problem? Now all of a sudden you got to have, the Department of War and the Department of Energy sitting there talking about shielding from EMPs and things like that that would prevent future episodes of something external interfacing with our nuclear weapon systems. And they certainly can't then show up in Congress and be like, yeah, we know about this and we took precautions. Well, what'd you take precautions against? What did you know you were taking precautions against if you built a system? So it creates more questions, I think, that people recognize they can't answer. And I wish in these hearings, some of those reps would, and I don't know the behind the scenes of how they what deal they make about what questions they ask and how much time. But again, as somebody with an intel investigation background, there are many, many missed opportunities on those forums to really drill down. And should there be more hearings in the future, again, I think there's much better people than witnesses. For as great as the witnesses are, and we love the stories, I want to see some secretaries. I want to see some CEOs, in there being asked questions on the record about origins and genesis of a lot of the programs that appear to be UAP, UFO adjacent.
And the interesting thing is, Knapp brought up that Russia and China have done more research into this, at least more research that he thinks has gone on. Now, and it's unlikely that they stopped doing this research once they became enemies with us again, because he hasn't been invited back, I guess, because it's not as safe now. But could they actually be more advanced than us as far as reverse engineering knowledge, considering they're more open to sharing information? Because, for instance, I showed that UFO missile video to a scientist friend of mine who is one of the top scientist friends in Canada. The small version of it, he didn't even give it a second look. Then I showed him the blown up version. Then
Mhm.
he was a bit interested, but it's like scientists overall, like we can look at Neil deGrasse Tyson, are very dismissive. Wouldn't it be better to not possibly be leaped by Russia and China to get this information out there? Or do we have enough people, do you think, secretly working on it that we can sleep safely?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. So my read on the whole spectrum of the geopolitics, let's call it, of this. Again, I have things in my lap that says, okay, well, here's specifically something that Russia was working on. Within that, my father-in-law talked about other papers he had sent to the Russian Duma that involved specifically the areas of consciousness and the consciousness interface and whatnot. And so when I go back and go back in time and get back up to the macro level and start looking across the broad spectrum of this, I think that there is enough evidence that the US and Russia, particularly, certainly reverse engineered craft and begin to extract technology from it. I think, I don't know if I've mentioned it on here before, at the fall of the Soviet Union in, the early 90s, We had a brain drain that came out of the former Soviet Union of scientists and physicists and people who very possibly worked on different areas of the same subject matter. And you see a lot of them were picked up right away and went into different Pentagon jobs and private industry jobs and Lockheed and Boeing and the rest of it. So you can look at technological process, let's say, 47 through 91, and then how it's increased from 91 through 2025. And don't forget, in that same period over in the East, then we had the Vietnam conflict, we had Cambodia, we had a few situations there as well, and even following World War II, where we had a brain drain of the Chinese talent into the United States as well. So I think in those ways there's probably a lot of alignment. Where I've assessed the differentiator is to circle back consciousness. My father-in-law's papers specifically talk about the not just the human journey of consciousness, but the consciousness of that interfaces with the craft and how that is a key component of it. So if we think in terms of a strategy out of or led by Russia, where the US sort of foo-foos the consciousness ideas in the 40s, 50s, 60s and thinks we're going to engineer our way out of that. But China and Russia have consistently maintained, even in their public policy and education and cultural and social programs, they have stressed this idea of universal thought and living in this universal bubble of sorts, and they closely relate all of the STEM sciences and art and things like consciousness. And it's manifested in a few ways. There's the one aspect they call the new sphere, which has actually worked itself into Russian policy and has been consistent pretty much from the time of the czars through communism, independence, Putin to today. And then you had this movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It still exists today of cosmicism, which was, more religiously focused. But Western analysts always took things Putin said when it came to that as just a cultural nuance of, Russian mysticism. Oh, it's just something that they've always believed in and they've dismissed it. And I think what we've seen is somebody has finally caught on in the US and said, no, we cannot engineer our way around this. And Russia, China, in many ways have launched, fed, supported, covertly the culture war of the United States, the dumbing down of America in many senses. And perhaps that was a specific strategy because, again, they recognize the importance of the development of human consciousness into the future and what it means for the future. And all these things Putin's talked about. So if there's a gap that we have, I think it's less of a technology gap, more of a gap in consciousness. And that's why we're seeing so much attention now and credibility given to things like psionics. Sorry if I went on there for a little bit.
No, it's fine. As far as the Navy rep, I was just going to look up his name again. You might know it offhand, but it seemed like the Navy gave him permission to talk about his incident. Why do you think they did that?
Yeah, Chief Wiggins. The Navy,
Is that
I
the
guess,
same was the Simpsons guy, or am
yes.
I crazy? Yeah, because it just keep popping into my head. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure he's gotten that more than once. The Navy overall, if people that I talk to seem to feel like there's a little bit of friction between like the Navy and the Air Force. and the Navy seems much more willing to talk about it, and they might even want to talk about it. Um, and that might be the culture of, being out there on your own, in the sea. We have laws, the laws of the sea, and international conventions and things like that. So that might just be part of the Navy culture, let's say, to be as transparent as they can be, and maybe having a goal of saying, yes, we need more public discussion about this, because perhaps so many people see something, that it would just make their job easier. It would make war fighting easier for them if there were public acknowledgement of it. Um, it could be. I had put out a couple of FOIA requests. Navy was the first. Navy came back within 3 business days. Surprisingly enough, NASA came back within 1 business day and shot it down and said, "We don't know what you're talking about. We're closing the case." And it's been June, July. It's been 5, 6 months now, and I'm still waiting to hear back from the Air Force in Sandia Labs. But the Navy responded, very quickly.
Very interesting. Yeah, as far as NASA, when I interviewed former Canadian Defense Minister Paul Hellyer, he said very expressively that NASA were liars and they know very well what's going on. Because all I can think about when they're talking about needing billions for this Mars expedition this week is it's like we seem to have fairly good proof we're being visited, yet we're supposed to worry about very microbial life potentially on Mars, and they want us to get excited about this. But
Yep.
I believe Paul Hellyer that how can they not have all these cameras out there and not know more what's going on?
Mm. Sorry. No, I agree, but I think it speaks to the disclosure strategy, let's say. I've talked about, we use this phrase controlled disclosure. That is a term of art in the intelligence community, in counterintelligence, that you want to get information out and you are controlling the method in which you've done it. But what that involves, I think, is a lot of what we've seen, using assets and using people, and I throw the term around again, term of art, useful idiots, to spread the information that you want spread in the way that you spread it. I think what's happened, though, with the advent of all the technology and communications and self investigations and community investigations, let's say, is that the ability to control that information has reached capacity. And so you have a portion of society in the UAP community, plus you have, let's say, society at large, to give it a name, who all feel as though, yep, there's something else out there. We don't know what it is. We don't know where it's coming from. But we're good. Yeah, there's definitely something out there, and more people wanting to get involved in finding it out and asking the questions. So the controlled disclosure framework reaches capacity and can't be contained anymore, and you begin to lose control. And I think what we're seeing, and I don't think it's an accident NASA made that announcement following these hearings. I very much, and I can probably find the tape somewhere in other shows that I talked about it. I saw this hearing as an attempt to hit the reset button. They titled it UAP Transparency, Restoring Trust in the Public, and Whistleblower Protections. All things that had already been previously talked about, but now they put a framework around it. You have the Disclosure Act that is an attempt to create that legislative framework, to create the structures that begin to tell the other agencies in the US government, how to work through these issues together, how information is going to be gathered, collected, exchanged, whether it's through this committee or whatnot. We might not like it, and it might not be what the community wants, but it is the only mechanism through which the government has. in order to put some structure around this issue. So if you accept that hypothesis, let's say, you have the reset hearing, with a little bit of new evidence that comes out that maybe starts creating some of this uncomfortableness and tension, where the DOD's now kind of got to answer for some things they really should. Again, even as taxpayers, I don't know how many millions each one of those missiles cost, but we certainly want to know they work every time we use them. And if they don't, we need to know why. And then you have NASA coming out talking about microbial life or signs of early life. That begins to open the door for other things, maybe more advanced forms of subtle life, not so much microbial, but little critters and creatures and crawlers and things like that. They're probably known about for 50 or 60 years. But it's, again, you got to look at it as less of, or you've just got to look at it as storytelling. They need to now tell a story that is palatable to not just this community, who, again, you're singing to the choir, we already believe it, but the public in general. They need to have structures in place that begin to help institutions, in society, help people get their minds around the issues. So I think, you still see all of these drips, but I think all of the drips are really geared towards road testing the reaction. And I said it when it came to, if you're familiar with the Cracker Barrel controversy that we had here a few weeks ago when they
Being
changed
from
their
Canada,
logo.
I don't think I've ever even been to one. Oh,
Oh,
even though I'm in Kansas right now, but
yeah, it's fantastic. But the idea is we couldn't handle that. Don't talk to me about, disclosure. People lost their minds that a logo changed. Let's not get into ontological shifts in our perceptions of the origins of humanity when we
yeah.
can't deal with a freaking logo change.
I mean, there's been riots for far less.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I've said it before, we've gone to war, we've gone to war on less solid intelligence and information than the collective amount of information that we have that supports UAP and the potential for alien life, but we still act like it's, like it's an unknown.
And the one thing about it that is the more frightening thing, even though some of the experiences vary, but overall it's very frightening experiences, is the abductions that they don't seem to be occurring as much now. Either that or people just aren't reporting them, or maybe they're aware that they're more likely to be captured in evidence these days with everyone having phones. But like, that's a scary thing to have to disclose. Oh, by the way, yeah, they'll also come down and there's potential they're going to capture you, put you in pain. Even Robert Salas
Yep.
had an experience like that, right? And he said it was painful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and then you have other people who say it was the most beautiful experience of their life. So it goes back to that threat picture of, do we not know, or do we know? Yes, there are good, there are bad, and the ability to, control that is out of the government's hands. There's the old, that old lingering story that's the deal that was made. You can snatch X number of people a year and, have at it. Just please be peaceful.
Yeah, because even for the controversies of the good and the bad, Betty and Barney Hill, although Betty admits, and I've researched them fairly extensively, listened to all of their interviews, she did not want to go at first, but she seemed to actually have an overall good experience. Barney did not have a good experience at
Yep.
all, and it was quite traumatizing to him, and he was violated. So I don't even know how Betty can talk about. I mean, that's I'd be a little pissed at my wife. She's like, "Oh, it was great."
Right. Well, it's like, it's like that, if you've ever seen the Saturday Night Live sketch with they do with Kate McKinnon, and they have her as a sort of, backcountry hillbilly trailer park type, And then they'll have, there's two other people who are also abducted, and the two people talk about being absorbed in light and how wonderful it was, and she talks about the aliens poking at her girly parts and slapping things around and whatnot.
What do you make of that David Jacobs, who I believe was a professor at Temple University at one point? He claims that he was abducted numerous times and it was very bad for him overall, although eventually, I mean, he was saying he was sexually gratified as a reward for going through some of the torture, which he did and eventually enjoy that part and have some humor with them at
Yeah.
various points. But overall, he really did not like it.
I mean, I've through the years and career and all of that before I got involved in any of this. I've dealt with a lot of people who were involved in very traumatic situations. So I have, you know, I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to say whether how legitimate one is over another, or the story. Yeah, sometimes there's some things I think I'm like, yeah, it might have been more in your head, um, or it's attention seeking, and there are indicators you can get out of that. But in a very general sense, I look at just hearing what anyone who says they are an experiencer says and believing them, um, because something happened. They believe something happened, and so they deserve some sort of action, some sort of help, whatever it is that they need to work through those things. And I see and I understand, there's all these there is a broad spectrum of what's reported when it comes to experiencers and abductees, and there's those cases of implants and things like that. So again, I don't have the answers, and I think it's one of those areas that we just continue to collect the evidence, we collect the stories, and continue to find ways to use the information. I think that's one of the areas that we just lack on so much. There's there is all of this evidence, and there's very few attempts, it seems, to put it together. And that's one of the things that we're beginning to work on, to try and find the bigger pictures around this, the singular incidents, to say, well, okay, what else was happening in that time, around that period, in that location? W- can we find patterns when we begin to do it to 10 or 15 or 20? Do we begin to identify patterns that allow us to then have more control, more ability to anticipate the phenomenon? Because I think the answers are there. It just takes bringing all the puzzle pieces together, reassessing them, standing back, and looking for those patterns. Because as I listen to things, I hear them. Now it's putting the sweat equity and elbow grease in to actually piece it together.
One guy I'm not so sure about because I've read his books, and to use a wrestling term, he puts himself over to a nauseating amount, and his books are classified as fiction, is Charles Hall, who a new interview came out of him this week. I'm just wondering your
I'm actually
thoughts
not
on it.
familiar with them offhand. It
Oh,
doesn't. Yeah,
oh, okay. All
yeah,
right.
it doesn't ring a bell. What does he get into?
He alleges that he was a weatherman in one of the areas around Area 51, and he was a weatherman on a base for tall white aliens over a period of years, and he was the only one that could last because of his his special ways that he would react to seeing them, that he would never get scared. He
I
talks
think
in his books, he was a great fighter, and he's also a genius and has come up with a proton theory, and he's incredibly intelligent, he'll tell you.
yeah, pretty
And
would.
yeah, they would take him up in the craft, and he goes into great detail. But I was
Yeah,
surprised Jesse Michaels did an interview with him this week, and it really kind of brings out some of his. I mean, he's a great storyteller,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I
You
don't
see,
believe.
maybe I have seen one, maybe because I think I watched a show where, this guy was almost talking. You'd have the picture in your mind. It was like a UFO bus station, and he's like, "Oh yeah, the Greys used to come down and then stop over, and we'd be talking, and like okay,
He's
I don't
got
know."
like a movie too that's on Tubi and various things, so he's definitely profiting from his stories.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's. I think it's um, like anything and everything, right? There are so many legitimate people who have experienced something, and as soon as they start getting attention, somebody else will come along and say, "Oh, I experienced that too, plus this." And then, "Oh, and I'm even more special than those two because I also got, this, that, and the other." Um, I perceive a lot of that, let's say, when it comes to, what can actually be proven, right? And believe me, I sit back with these papers, Hannibal, all the time, and I'm like, "Oh, I should just come up with some fantastic metaphysical story about how they manifested or, whatnot." I said, "I'd have more attention from them."
Yeah, and I'll just tell the fans a story. I believed him more before I read the books because there was like a speech of him online back in 2012 where he didn't go into all that much detail and it seemed possible. And then he actually, it was the same time that I interviewed Travis Walton. He initially agreed to do an interview with me if I bought all 5 of his books, which ended up being just under 300 American, but I'd also have to pay him $1,000
Yeah.
and I could go out to his house. So I'm
I
about to do this. We're getting closer. And then he's
Yeah,
like, "Oh, who is your cameraman?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's my father-in-law. Where is this cameraman his first job?" I'm like, "No, he works for Transport Canada."
yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, well, I can't do the interview now because he could be a government official. I can't allow him in the house." I'm like, "Well, he won't come. I'll do it." He's like, "Oh, I'm going to have to pass on this, but you could come to my next presentation and we'll actually give you credit for being the furthest one to travel to one of my presentations if you come from Canada." I'm like, can I film a presentation?" "Oh, no, you can't.
No, 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 can't.
But I might give you a short interview at it." So he seemed like a bit of a hustler.
Yeah, and again, there's fine lines. I've had these discussions with people. A friend who was talking about having somebody who's a major figure in the area appear, and and I get it. On the one hand, I'm like, look, listen, these guys still have families and homes, and they've got to kind of make a buck, right? And doing this show, doing what you do is not cheap. I know what you do is not inexpensive and is time consuming. I'm fortunate. I'm retired. So I
Who's
have a lot
funding
more.
are you self-funding, by the way, all your research?
Yeah. Yep.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yep. It's all me.
One thing
And
one thing I will say about my UFO stuff, and I'm
yeah.
sure the fans don't doubt it, I'm doing this for my own interest.
Yeah.
I mean, I might get some that will make some money at some time, but, like, I could talk about some piece of gossip in wrestling and get more views. I actually wanna know about this, and I research it at
Yeah.
least 3 or 4 hours a day.
I mean, and fair is fair. Audio, video, all the changes that come out online. There's equipment and all of that stuff that you need to do in order to put together something that the fans can respond to. And I'm sure in the same way on the wrestling side, right? These guys, they're not all multimillionaires jet setting around. If you wanted to, you've got to buy some plane tickets and the rest of it. So I don't fault anybody, but I ran into a similar situation of somebody who I feel should have had a vested interest in the materials that I had, because they've spent so much of their career on some particular aspects, let's say, that are directly related to them. And I reached out in terms of a corroboration, a partnership, where I'm like, hey, listen, I'll do whatever licensing stuff it is. I don't want a dollar from you for anything. Take it, run with it. It gives you a bunch of new material and things like that. And then as more of the research side of what I'm working on materializes, we can roll into things like that. But just like, the situation you talked about, he came back, he's like, well, if you want to hire me as a consultant, if, you want to put me on staff, if any of those things. And I'm like, well, honestly, if I have to hire somebody, you're not the guy I'm going to be hiring. When it comes down to it, it's like I was trying to kind of, do you a favor, throw you a bone, but not able to do it.
And the other thing is now absolutely everyone has a podcast. So like it's a lot more difficult when it used to be. Back when I interviewed Travis Walton, for instance, like there wasn't a million Travis Walton interviews. So if you had to pay him, you'd get it back. But now it's like, okay, well, there's 15 of them out there. You're not worth as much. Then they get insulted, but whatever. But I'm happy to have you on and pick your brain. You're an expert in this. You want to tell us a little bit about your projects? And your book is engineeringinfinitybooks.com.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, and I'll just leave it at that right now. Go on the website. The book is there. It is in a flip book format, 294 pages. You can explore it, flip through it. Not an easy read. You have to be somebody who likes science. But we've got a team behind the scenes working on new translations. We're working on ways to add to the narrative, let's say, and bring in some of the real cases to make it more relatable, and just get into the menu. There's research, there's tables, everything I talk about with the research I've done in the government programs. It's all out there. And yeah, we're just working on a lot of other things to, again, help people get their minds not only around this material, but what I think is more important, start thinking post disclosure. It's one thing to know it, but then what does it mean? And so I'm looking at a few initiatives to how we can help that, and help other organizations who are focused on that as well.
Excellent. Well, I hope we can have you on again soon to pick apart more news. You can leave whatever message you want with the fans.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate it. Thank you for the time. Happy to jump in anytime. And anyone, again, through the website, engineeringinfinitybook.com, reach out to me. I'm, try to help as much as I can and connect
You
with
have an
people.
event too, before I forget, in Massachusetts, right? Coming up in October.
Yes, very good. Thank you. Massachusetts MUFON, October 5th, is hosting a symposium. I will be there. We have some other great speakers. If you look up Massachusetts MUFON in Facebook, you'll see a link to it there. I think they're still setting up sort of the registration stuff, or however that's going to work, but it's a public event. It'll be streamed. And then the YouTube channel right now is American Road Warrior. If you go on there, at least subscribe, hit the button for that. That is the Jim Allrock, the PR guy and media guy for Mass MUFON.
Is that him?
That's him there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, that's it. That's the site.
Perfect. Awesome. So find it, subscribe to it, and hopefully we'll have you back soon. Can we get another pose? The fans.
You got it? You get that screenshot?